you join me on this lovely rainy evening to talk about foot pressure in the squat. So what is good foot pressure in the squat? Most people know that they should be aiming for some sort of mid-foot pressure throughout the squat. We want to have the most efficient movement possible, so the more directly down and directly up we can, the better. Any sort of unnecessary movement forward or back, both on the descent and the ascent, is an inefficiency, and we want to try and solve that as much as we can. By all means, it will never be perfect. Everyone, even if you're leveraged really, really well, everyone will have a slight bias towards either a toe or heel pressure, typically a toe pressure. So, it's not going to be perfect, but we want to know how can we improve it. So very briefly, what is toe, midfoot, and heel pressure in the squat? Well, they are quite self-explanatory. Toe pressure is when you are sitting too far forward onto your toes. This is typically characterized with breaking at the knees too much. So we see knees traveling too far forward. This isn't an issue in any injury way, it's just, for most people, less efficient. We want a balance on the way down, which is what midfoot is. Midfoot, we break with, more often than not, the knees and the hips at the same time. We sit down evenly and we stand up evenly. And heel pressure is typically a sitting back style of movement. People break with their hips too much, they sit onto their heels, and then their hips rise too much on the ascent. So, we want to meet in the middle with these. How do we do that? Well, firstly, we need to get comfortable in a midfoot position. So if that means that you have always biased sitting far too forward, breaking with the knees, we need to start cueing the opposite, breaking with the hips. And vice versa for a sitting back hip and heel style squat. We need to think about breaking with the knees. So firstly, let's not think about the lower body anyway, but let's think about the upper body, as that tends to help. Another addition to this whole discussion with heel pressure is flexion or extension of the spine. If you bias flexion too much, i.e. you round over, you let your chest collapse, often this will be as a result of having your knees go too far forward. You're in a position your body cannot sustain, and your body loosens. In the opposite way, somebody who has a very heel and hip dominant kind of squat will often be in too much extension. They'll often have their chest too far up, their back will be rounded in this kind of sense, in a curved way. They'll have their hips go right back, they'll be on their heels, and their hips will rise as a result. You can also see hips rising as a result of too much flexion. However, that's a whole nother discussion. That tends to be due to back weakness. So, we want to have a neutral spine. Maybe a little bit of extension, but we want to have our chest up a moderate amount. We want to have neutral lower back, maybe a slight bit of extension. I tend to at least think about having a slight bit of extension, as that helps me to maintain and achieve a good position. And we, more often than not, want to be in a position where we can break with both our knees and hips at the same time. If you are crunching down too much with your core, if your chest is collapsing or just low, it's going to be very difficult for you to break with your hips, because the hips don't want to break. If your core is crunching down too much, they're not going to be able to move. Adversely, you're not going to be able to break with your knees very well if the only thing that's rounding in any way is your lower back. If your lower back and hips are already rounded, that's the only thing that will move, and your knees won't want to go forward. So, we want to try and achieve a neutral or slightly extended position with our torso and our spine. From here, when we've achieved this good core position and good chest position, we want to think about breaking evenly with the hips and the knees. Very simply, this looks like breaking them at the same time during the squat. We want to go down evenly, and so we want to think about putting equal pressure on our knees and hips. Now, bringing this back to a spectrum, if you're someone that has always had their knees go forward, you'll have to think about breaking with the hips more. This is very much true for me, because it makes sense to me to break my knees, and it never really made sense to break with my hips, never made sense to push my hips back, never made sense to have that bit of extension in my lower back. I now only think about that, and that's kind of brought the pendulum, if you will, from here. I think about here, and it kind of just swings into the right place. Adversely, if you have a very hip dominant squat, if you sit back too much, you want to think about breaking with the knees. You just want to think about knee pressure, maybe even think about toe pressure a little bit, allow yourself to sit into them a little bit, and hopefully it will go down evenly. Now, with that in mind, now that we have the vague idea of how to cue these, we need to look at how do we reinforce these. When we want to think about how can we reinforce these correct positions, there are three different things we can think about. Number one is what accessory work, what strength work needs to be done to maintain these positions. Number two, what warm-up drills, what activation drills, what kind of processes should we be doing beforehand to really kind of ingrain these. And number three, what variations or how should we train the squat in order to ingrain these technical elements. For the main accessories and strengthening movements, we want to mainly think about core, because that's what's going to help us maintain our torso throughout. Things like heavy planks, standing cable crunches, back extensions, anything that will help us target the muscles in a kind of specific way. For example, sit-ups, though great for developing abs, won't have as much carryover, whereas standing cable crunches will have that little bit more carryover, a little bit more specific, enables to use a lot of weight, which is great. Planks, probably the most specific, it allows us to really be bracing with weight on our back, like a squat, and enables us to cue and practice having a good neutral position, a good strong chest. And lastly, things like back extensions are great for developing that little bit of extension needed, developing the strength so that flexion doesn't happen. Can't really go wrong with those. Now, in terms of what activation movements, what warm-up movements, things like bird dogs, things like even back extensions before squatting, things like cat-cows, things like McGill crunches, they're great. Any movement that really allows us to practice maintaining or moving our spine through flexion and extension will be the key. If you're someone that tends to bias towards too much flexion, something like a bird dog, something like a back extension would be great. It enables us to practice achieving and maintaining a good amount of extension, chest up, etc., etc. If you're someone that biases too much extension and we want to achieve a little bit more flexion, crunch our ribs down, something like a McGill crunch, possibly even just conventional sit-ups maybe, practicing bringing our ribs down, practicing crunching and maintaining that position, that's great. That will hopefully, whether you're on either end of the spectrum, anything that will help you bring us to the center, the better. And now, lastly, in terms of what variations, how we should be training the squat for this, pause squats, tempo squats, anything that allows us to really spend a little bit more time, especially on the descent or in the hole, a little bit more time to feel out what we're doing, a little bit more time to practice what we're doing, the better. Typically, this would just look like ascending sets, especially when we're trying to learn something. Doing ascending sets up to a top set, so it allows us to spend a little bit more time warming up and getting to a top set so it can really ingrain in us. For me personally, pause squats have been the thing. I typically don't like tempo squats for myself, so pause squats have been the thing that immediately stuck and the thing that immediately allowed me to feel out how I should be sitting onto my heels that little bit. For others though, tempo squats are absolutely great. That little bit more time on the descent is the key for a lot of people, just to feel out typically heel pressure if they're too toe bias and vice versa. Those movements are great. We can also think a little bit about, before we even do the movement, simply how, again, if we're typically toe bias, before we start the movement, thinking about rooting our heels in, just thinking about sitting onto our heels, or if we're too much on a heel, just thinking about, just leaning that bit forward, thinking about being on our toes, rooting our toes in, I tend to find that just conceptualizing and feeling that out before we even start the movement, that alone has a big impact on us doing the movement, and that tends to help a lot of people. So if we can go into the movement thinking about whatever foot pressure we want to bias in order to get to that good middle zone, then doing things like tempo squats, horse squats, will hopefully enable us to learn and really feel out a good balanced midfoot pressure. So hopefully this video has been at least somewhat helpful. It's kind of hard to properly fix deeply ingrained technical issues, especially with a squat, from just watching one YouTube video. However, everything we've discussed here at least vaguely explains the vast majority of squat issues I see, both with powerlifters and with just normal gym people. Having too weak a core, too weak a back, the wrong kind of flexion or extension, or just general spine and core position, the wrong kind of foot pressure, everything like this kind of explains most issues you see in the gym. So at the very least, I do think it's a good idea. Just film your squats, just have a look. Are you breaking with the knees too much? Are you sitting too far back? Are your heels coming up? Are your toes coming up? Either way, that's some sort of inefficiency that we can probably solve. And I think by taking this advice on board, and especially by increasing your core strength at the very least, your squat will go up. These things help the stability and therefore the consistency of our movement, and that's only a benefit. So, hopefully it has helped, and hopefully I can continue to help in the future. Have a lovely time, guys.